We are joined now by Ryan Talbot. He is a Bills writer for New York Upstate and Syracuse.com. What's up, Ryan?
Hey, not too much. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it seems like a couple years ago, 3 or 4, we maybe would have been calling to talk about Harrison Phillips, but the gift that keeps on giving. This is before he went to Minnesota, but we get another Buffalo transition into Nebraska. You had to know right away when our producer's like, hey, can you come on and talk with a station in Nebraska? You knew what we would be talking about, I'm guessing.
You know, a little bit. I had a hunch.
So why isn't Josh Allen able to take care of sorry. So I may get to that later if we've got time. But we obviously want to talk about John Butler. Presumably, I don't think it's actually been announced yet, but presumably Nebraska.
There's fiscal calendars, Ravi.
I understand that. That's why, usually it's July 1st, though, so I thought they would announce it by now. Presumably Nebraska's new secondary coach, most recently with the Buffalo Bills. So I guess, broad strokes here, give you a little leeway on how you want to answer this, but what should Nebraskans expect from their new secondary coach, John Butler, based on your experience with him up in Buffalo?
Yeah, I would expect a unbelievable secondary. Honestly, I mean, this guy could work with anyone and get the most out of them. If you look at his tenure in Buffalo, you can look at, he inherited Trey White, a first-round pick. He helped Trey White get to Pro Bowl, All-Pro type caliber levels. But it wasn't just the top caliber players at cornerback either. And I know he had Karen Johnson, one of the best nickels as well. But Dane Jackson, a guy that's in Carolina now, he helped him get a nice little contract in Carolina because of the way that he was able to develop the 7th-round pick. He brought in Kevin Johnson for a year from the Texans. Kevin Johnson held down the fort when given the opportunity. They have brought in, Christian Benford is their number 2 cornerback going into this year, but at times he played like a number 1 cornerback, and this was another day 3 small school.
Yeah, Villanova guy.
He gets the most out of his players. The only cornerback that really hasn't panned out under his watch has been Kyer Elam, and I think that was more of a circumstance of Elam being more of a man coverage type of player in college, the Bills being a heavy zone type of scheme. But from top to bottom at cornerback, he's been able to get the most out of players. And then, safety position as well. If you want to talk defensive backs as a whole, we know what they had there in Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer. But that secondary always played really well. It wouldn't shock me if sooner rather than later, John Butler even emerges and becomes their defensive coordinator. He's that good of a coach.
Yeah, so a lot of people have kind of fast forwarded, right? With Nebraska's defensive coordinator, Tony White, he's courted just about every offseason for another job, and Coach Rhule has been extremely open about, hey, listen, I know he's going to be a head coach one day. For us, we prepare in the moment. I want all my guys ready. How important, given Coach Butler's personality, do you think it was to have his defensive coordinator involved in the hiring process from a philosophical or a teaching or just a personality standpoint? How important would that be to Butler?
I think that'd be very important. And listen, Butler is phenomenal with the X's and O's. This is a guy that was running the defensive meetings a lot of the time for the Bills. Sean McDermott was their play caller. He's their head coach, but this past season, it was John Butler that did a lot of the meetings and ran them and made sure guys knew, what the expectations were. I think that if the Bills didn't already have someone waiting in the wings in Bobby Babich that they didn't want to lose, someone that was getting a lot of attention elsewhere this offseason before they were able to kind of name him as the defensive coordinator, I think Butler would have been the guy for that job. So, Butler in terms of being on the same page with his head coach, that's big. He's a great teacher, though. There are players that will come out and say nothing but high praise for this coach, and you don't always get that in this business.
Yeah.
We're talking with Ryan Talbot of Syracuse.com. Ryan, so talk about the Babich and Butler situation here for a second, because I'm not sure. I know there's been some articles about it, but I'm not sure Nebraskans necessarily totally understand the intricacies of what happened there. in terms of naming the new defensive coordinator and Butler ultimately deciding to part ways with Buffalo. Kind of get into that situation and how that all played out.
Yeah, well, so, I'll give the short version first. I think what it came down to is they're probably both up for the job. And at the end of the day, the Bills probably looked at Babich and being a younger coach, someone that has had a lot of success already in his own right. He was a linebackers coach. We know how well he's done with
Milano
and this past season, Terrell Bernard just kind of came out of nowhere and put up great numbers. He was in the secondary with the safeties, Poyer and Hyde, obviously doing great things there. So it was probably a very tough decision, but what probably swayed them in the way of Babich was he was getting interest and interview requests elsewhere, and the Bills probably didn't want to have to lose him, knowing that he's still a younger coach. His dad was a great coach in this league for many, many years. So I think at the end of the day, to make sure that they could keep him in Buffalo, they gave him that title. And Butler, knowing that he probably, should have been, I can't say should have been the D coordinator, but should have been in heavily considered for that role. When he didn't get it, he probably said, I need to go somewhere. Or I need to take a little time off until I can find a spot where I can be a D coordinator for a big program. And we know that's not what he's doing now, but I think sooner rather than later, that will be the case.
So, in the weeds here in Nebraska, Nebraska's general manager, Sean Patton and Butler have a connection going all the way back to Catholic University, where Butler was a coach. And I understand my tree and how far those branches reach out, but how would you pit the previous connections that he may or may not have with some guys at Nebraska versus his availability on the open market versus the quickness in which they got the deal done? Because some skeptics may say, okay, well, there's a past relationship. He was available. Why was he out on the open market versus, wow, this was a really good job by Nebraska getting this guy in almost a seamless, quiet transition. How do you kind of buoy or how would you mediate that discussion?
Well, first and foremost, connections are huge in college football, pro football. If you look at Buffalo's front office, there's a lot of connections of guys that have either left and come back or Carolina connections and this, that, and the other. It happens in the business, and I'm sure that played a role in John Butler getting hired. But I can say for a fact that once he decided to part ways with the Bills, there was interest across the league. A few teams, but they just already had kind of interviews done for coordinators. But once he became available, they almost shifted and changed gears a little bit. I think timing had a lot to do with it in terms of why he was still on the market when he was. But like I said, in terms of a teacher, in terms of the X's and O's, Butler is an excellent communicator. The connection is the connection. There's probably something to that, but this isn't just like they just hired their buddy. This is an excellent coach that Nebraska ended up getting. And I said as much as soon as I saw that was announced on social media.
So, Brian, what's the general feeling about John Butler and the way his departure happened? I guess amongst sort of the team itself more so than fans. It is, was he still looked upon favorably and it was just like, hey, this isn't the right fit anymore? Or I guess I'm just curious about kind of the tone of the departure outside of the granular details.
Yeah, I think there were a lot of players that were disappointed to see him go. My colleague Tim Graham wrote a piece on The Athletic, and he said that he had players without him reaching out to them. Reach out to him first and foremost, just to say what a great coach he was and to speak, highly of this guy. And that tells you what kind of coach John Butler was. It tells you what kind of support he had in this locker room, how much they thought of him as a coach and how much he helped develop players. We had him as a guest on our podcast a few months ago, probably about 2 months ago. And he talked about the preparation that he takes for this job and how he does get some satisfaction out of seeing some of his players go elsewhere, like a Dane Jackson, and get a nice contract, or seeing players get re-signed like Taron Johnson and become the highest paid nickel cornerback in the league, which I believe that's no longer the case, but at the time it was. So, he knows that his coaching and the players reach out and say as much to him have played a role in helping these guys. A lot of these, day 3 picks, Taron Johnson was a day 3 pick, and I've already gone over some others. Help them not just make the league, but develop and become players that are sought after in this league.
Yeah, full disclosure, Ryan, a Nebraska alum, played there. My son was heavily recruited. He's in that room as a freshman. So I immediately on Friday and Saturday, Friday night, barely slept. Coach Coop obviously played a huge role in the recruiting along with some other guys. But I say all that to say I'm always curious when guys have been out of the college game for a little while and they come back, how important it is for the relationship building versus the teaching, right? They're both extremely important, but for 18 to 22-year-olds, the rapport can be huge, especially replacing a guy like Coach Coop, who was so integral in kind of setting the tenor for that room. What strengths does Coach Butler have in terms of building those relationships, considering, and I said this on Monday, I came back and I said, the thing that made me the most impressed is not just asking some of my guys that are connected with the NFL, but it was that the players were kind of, without saying it, like, that's our guy. You don't hear, I've been cut in 2 NFL locker rooms. You don't often hear that players have relationships with their position coaches. We hear a lot of the business aspect. So that kind of put me at ease a little bit, that so many guys were talking about the connection he had with them.
Yeah. They all say that when it comes to communication, when it comes to the teaching aspect of it, which that's going to be huge, probably even bigger, obviously, in college football than even in the pros, that he was one of the best at doing it. He was the way that he communicated to players, the way that he would work on techniques or communicate to them what kind of techniques they needed to work on. They said that he was just a straight shooter in that approach, but a great teacher as well. So communication has always been one of his strong suits. And like you said, he hasn't been in college since Penn State, but he did a great job at Penn State before coming to Buffalo. This is a guy that has a track record that has followed him for quite a few years now. So I think, if anything, these last few years in the NFL, the resume that he's built with these players, the guys that haven't been recruited into major colleges, like we just said, a Villanova guy and Christian Benford, and these day 3 picks, and Pitt's a big program, but Dane Jackson was a round 7 pick. He's been able to get the most out of these guys. So now you're getting players that were recruited in Nebraska, and he's going to be able to kind of coach them up even further than what they received, obviously, at the high school level, or some of them that have already been in the program. The way that he communicates is going to speak volumes, and I really think you're going to see a high level of play in that secondary with John Butler as their coach.
All right, Ryan, before we get you out of here, I'm going to change gears on you here real quick, because in addition to –
not to mention, I'm going to preface this by saying, sorry to interrupt, we go back and forth about Josh Allen on this show a lot.
Oh, I was going to go.
We got to give him some grace on any questions he wants to know about Buffalo.
I actually wanted to. So, in addition to obviously being in Nebraska and being a Nebraska fan, I have a weird affinity for Florida State, and so I love your guy Keon Coleman that you guys brought in. Like, do you have a Keon Coleman story yet? Because it seems like every video I see of him, like we didn't get a lot of this at Florida State. I don't know. Like, he seems like he just kind of is finding his personality a little bit up there in Buffalo.
It's still a little bit early, but I'm sure by the end of training camp, we'll all have some Keon Coleman stories. But he has made a great first impression in terms of meeting with the media and all these clips that you've seen on social media. But this was someone that Josh Allen wanted. When the first night of the draft was over, he pretty much told Brandon Beane as much. He's like, Keon Coleman's the guy that I like. He didn't test well at the combine in terms of the 40 speed, but when you looked at the actual route running and the speed that he had on the route tree and some of the routes that he'd have to run in the NFL, which I think is more valuable than just straight line speed, he was among the best in his group. He's a big target. He's a physical target. I think that's exactly what the Bills were looking for an X receiver this offseason. And rookies, they're not going to come in generally and set the league ablaze. We saw that with last year's rookie class. A lot of players that we thought were going to be instant impact guys weren't necessarily. Some were. I think in this year's class, Dunze and Marvin Harrison Jr. have a great chance of being those impact guys right out of the gate. I think Coleman might take a little bit of time, but Buffalo last year, over 3,000, plays run, all this pass plays, very pass-heavy offense. They only had 8 defensive holding and total of 8 defensive holding and defensive pass interference penalties called on the opposition all of last season. They ran a lot of routes, and Stephon Diggs isn't an overly physical player. Gabe Davis was an overly physical player. I think that they wanted to get a physical presence in there that would fight for that ball, that would draw some more defensive holding, defensive pass interference penalties, and that's where it's going to come in early on for Keon Coleman. He's going to be a red zone weapon. He's going to be a guy that you're going to try to get it to him in a tight space, which Allen can obviously do with that arm strength and those small windows. So I think a lot goes into it, but in terms of the person and the personality, Coleman has already stood out quite a bit.
All right, I fibbed. I want to ask one more just because I have an affinity for his running style. More important in terms of their involvement in the offense this year, James Cook building on whatever it was, 1,100 yards. I know he only had the 2 touchdowns, 1,100 yards, or the development of Khalil Shakir?
Ooh, that's a great question. Well, I guess I'm going to go with James Cook. I want to say Shakir, but I think that the Bills are going to spread the ball out a lot in the passing game. You have Dalton Kincaid. You have Shakir that came on strong. We already mentioned Keon Coleman. They brought over Curtis Samuel, who already has history with Joe Brady and a really successful season with Joe Brady under his belt in Carolina. James Cook, though, is going to be a focal point in terms of getting this running game going. He's such a good pass catcher generally. He had some pretty bad drops last year. He probably dropped about 3 or 4 touchdowns that hit him on the hands. Definitely something that would concern you a little bit. But the way that he could pick up big chunks of yards on the ground, the way that when he does catch the ball, the vision that he has, the burst that he has, I think that he'll be such a huge focal point because we saw last year when they made the shift to Joe Brady, that time the interim offensive coordinator, that they were going to get the run game more involved. That Dallas game last year where the run plays just kept working with James Cook, and he pretty much said, you know what, that wasn't our original game plan, but if something's working, why go away from it? And they just kept calling it. And they started to lean on that a little bit more. That will help Josh Young. It'll help the play action pass and help this offense. So between those two, it's a tough call, but I'd go James Cook.
That's Ryan Talbot. He covers the Buffalo Bills for New York Upstate for Syracuse.com and hosts the Buffalo Bills News podcast. Ryan, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Love the versatility.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ryan.
You got it. Thanks, guys.